Thank you all for joining. I know we all have people coming in, but you're here to talk about our deep dives. This is our deep dive series. For those of you who haven't been to one of these yet, we take a lot of topics that come out of Champ office hours that people have a lot of really good questions on, and then we dive deeper into them. So this one is going to cover inheriting an instance, and what I love about what Courtney and Rico have put together is it's good for everyone, even if you are nowhere near inheriting an instance or you've been in the same one for 5 years. It's really good stuff. So just house rules. So obviously, I'm sure all of you have been to a mug before, but if not, we just want to remind everybody, like, no self-promoting or pitching is permitted. Don't contact people outside without their consent. If you have their consent, then I'd love for everyone to be friends. So that's great. And if anyone here shares a use case, like, please don't share it without their consent. This one is being recorded thanks to my friends online that remind me to record sessions. So thank you for that. We will also be posting it online afterwards. So just keep that in mind. And if you aren't already a member of the chapter, I just encourage everyone to be a member of the chapter so you get the invites when Bevy decides it wants to actually send emails out. That will happen. Also, keep in mind that we try and post this stuff on LinkedIn. So if you see it, feel free to follow us there. And then you will get all the notifications for these in the future. And the topics are going to be all over the place. Really cool stuff. So I definitely encourage you to join this one. Okay, other stuff for Marketo users. There is a Journeys in Marketo Engage. This is now already changed names. It is Engagement Canvas. So if you see the word Journeys, erase it from your mind. It is now called Engagement Canvas. But the North America Virtual Mug is doing a session to highlight this. And if you want to learn more about it, definitely go sign up on that mug page for sure. And then Champ office hours, where we get all this good stuff. This is happening tomorrow at the same time. So if you haven't registered for this, please do. And if you have any questions, or if you even want to start planting some ideas that you want deep dives to happen, then go ahead and join office hours. There's a lot of mugs happening. Here's a really long list, and there's another slide on this of all the mugs happening. A lot of these are back in person. So if you live in an area where a mug is close by and you haven't been in person yet, definitely encourage that. They're a lot of fun. So go ahead and join these. These are the ones that are across the pond from me, not necessarily from all of you, but these are really cool to join if you are in that area. Okay, for those of you who aren't certified or are certified and don't want to pay to do it again, they actually have this cool new renewal thing that if you have a current cert and just need to renew, you can do so without paying. So that's super cool. So check that out if you haven't done it. If you're coming up to your renewal date, I'd highly recommend that route. Who doesn't like free stuff? Most people know that there's a bunch of different levels, but the expert is what the MCE is, and then the master is what the MCSA was. So go check this stuff out if you haven't done certifications in a while. Okay, before I get started, the clickable link. I can definitely send you the clickable links. Yes, good question. I'll do that while we're doing some Q&A. Okay, so I'm going to kick us off with this inheriting an instance. If you all have questions along the way, feel free to put them in the chat because we are saving time at the end to answer all your questions. So I will gather those all, and then I will get Courtney and Rico to answer them for you at the end. All right, so without any further ado, I want to introduce Courtney Edwards-Jones, a marketing operations manager at Zora. Welcome, Courtney. Tell us a little bit more about you.
Sure. So I have been, I have over 10 years experience from a B2C and B2B hybrid world. I started working with Marketo about 5 years ago, work with Zora now, and came from that hybrid world where I both built an instance and inherited one, and then have inherited a second instance along with an incredible team that actually comes from Adobe and Marketo as well. So really, really great people around me. I live in the UK. I'm actually from Texas originally, but I've been living in the UK for years and years and years. So I appreciate that many people are going to hear an accent. I don't actually hear it. I think I sound exactly like everybody else in the States and really different than my friends over here. But I live in Manchester. So just a shout out if anybody's going to the EMEA Summit that is next week. We're going to have a Marketo mixer there. So get in touch with me. I definitely give consent. We can be friends. Find me on LinkedIn and let's meet up.
Awesome. Thank you, Courtney. And then we have Enrico Delion, a senior manager of marketing operations at JAMA Software. Rico.
Hi, welcome everyone. I hope I'm not on mute. If not, someone will tell me. Yes, I've been working as a marketing professional for 15 years now. This is about 7 or 8 years in Marketo, Engage, maybe 20 years if you factor in that COVID year. So yeah, I've been in about 4 or 5 different instances. So this was a topic near and dear to my heart. So I guess we can get the ball rolling. So understandably, inheriting an instance is a massive undertaking. So this webinar is going to be far from exhaustive, but we wanted to cover some of the key first steps across 5 areas to help you start off successful if you're in this scenario, or to maybe use this as a chance to go back and review some of these tips. Then we'll provide you with a short list of action items and a few resources that will help you build a more robust work back plan at the conclusion of this call. But first, an important message. By failing to prepare, you are preparing to fail. That's our friend, the judgmental pug. This is why we call this section the work before the work. Setting yourself up for success happens before you even step foot into your Marketo Engage instance. So first off, it's not who you know, it's not what you know, it's who you know. So prior to logging in, it's important to get an understanding of your Marketo and your MOPS environment at your company. Getting to know the various stakeholders gives valuable context to the instance, as well as frames your action plan for the near term. During these conversations, you'll want to uncover operational pain points with the current processes, engage the general perception of Marketo across the business. Pay careful attention to the current workflows within the functional groups. Is there like a project intake system like Asana or Rike or something else? And what are the KPIs and OKRs? Use this onboarding period as a springboard to cultivate partnerships with stakeholders and teams, and formulate an action plan that addresses immediate and long-term needs right in front of you. Something that you don't want to do, and we're all guilty of doing this, is assume that you know the needs of the business based on your previous experience in companies or other instances. Each organization and each instance, as you know, is different, and doing the prep work will save you some sanity. And as I mentioned before, don't jump straight into changing the instance in Marketo and viewing your Marketo and marketing efforts as a silo. The other big point about this pre-game work is knowing that documentation can be a game changer. For me, documentation serves as a historical roadmap in how the organization understands the MOPS function, the marketing operations function, as well as serving as a starting point for your SOPs. So during that review process of the docs, you can incorporate changes based on the pain points you previously uncovered. Establishing a central document repository is an excellent way of keeping track of owners, access, overviews even to those docs, versions, and linking directly to them. I find it helpful to walk through those docs as you start working in the Marketo instance, to keep notes and make those changes so that you don't have to hunt and search for it later on down the line. Another tip I would say is, as you're working and re-reviewing those docs, taking that original text in the documentation and pasting it below to serve as like a historical or a change log of sort for your end users. Concurrent to this redocumentation process, I think it's helpful to get support from those stakeholders or department leads. They'll help. I think this will assist in broad adoption of these platform updates. And I know this is a lot of like extra work, but if you have the chance, I would consider writing your docs to specific audiences. So let's say you have a specialist, maybe those are more process, how-to oriented. But for leaders, maybe having shorter summarized versions with the high impact points of those documentation pieces. The last thing I wanted to say about this is communicate those changes and communicate them often. You could do this in the form of like release updates or a shared document, or the repository is a great place. And that will summarize those changes to your processes. Part of that is to reiterate that the documentation is a living article. So it's meant to serve your teams. And I think championing that documentation will help reduce the frustration for your end users and maybe reduce the time to fix recurring issues.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think documentation is obviously super helpful, and we've all been in an instance where you have none. So Courtney, interested to hear what you think about documentation and its importance here.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. In fact, I think that knowing what we have in store for you guys coming up, you'll notice how many times we do refer back to documentation. So this is really important. I also want to call out here that as we start to, because in the next steps, we're going to start diving into the instance. And as we start to, we're going to make a lot of presumptions that by the time you're at the point that you're inheriting an instance, that you have experience with Marketo specifically. But it's not as frequent, but it's not completely unknown to then come into a Marketo instance with actual experience in another map, or, different set of transferable skills coming into it. So one thing to note is that Adobe actually has really incredible product documentation, some of the best I've seen out there with vendors and tools that I've used. So, and in the last release, they kind of gave that whole area a refresh. And so when you get into the instance, which I know this is before you get in, but once you get in the help icon in the top right-hand corner, there's going to be lots of resources for you there, resources to the community to ask questions so you can reach out to people. There's also lots of documentation that we're going to refer to at the end there, where there's already some guides and some thorough steps on inheriting an instance, and those will live in that community. But also there is a new release as part of the latest release for help guides and product guides. So they're in-app guides on how to do some of the more frequently requested, a review of the more frequently requested functionality, and it's broken down by complexity for you. So again, as Kimberly mentioned, like the information we talk about today isn't just great for if you're inheriting an instance, it's also a great refresher for just staying on top of your instance and keeping it healthy. And that's a really great place to look for documentation that maybe already exists as well. All right, so moving on and diving into it. So when you're ready to start working in the instance, you can obviously start to work anywhere. We would highly recommend not starting with the marketing activities, and we're going to talk about why. But the best place to start in our opinion is going to be the admin section. This is going to be like the living heart of your instance. So optimizing your admin panel is going to bring some immediate value, but one of the first things you want to do is set some guidelines if they're not already there. So this is going to be your practical governance or your risk mitigation controls, if you will. A lot of times these may already be set, and during your conversations before you even entered into the instance, you may realize that they're not exactly what they need to be. But either way, you can go in and get these set first so that as you're working through the rest of the instance, because it's not, a one-day job inheriting an instance and getting everything set up. It's going to take a while. You at least know there's some practical boundaries set in your instance, so things aren't going to be going wrong, and you're going to have to be fixing the fires while you're really trying to dive in and map out how to build like a really great framework for your instance. So first one is looking at your roles and permissions. Starting with the roles, obviously, people will roll up, the users will roll up into certain roles, and they have different permission sets in Marketo. So review those roles and make sure that they align with what people should be able to do. And then who's in the instance, and do they have the right role and permission set attached to them? Are there people in there that no longer need to be? Are there API users that can be deactivated? After you sat down with all your stakeholders, you'll understand what people need access to and what reporting they might need to be able to see. And all of that can be kind of controlled there. So you want to make sure you've got that right, and the right people can get to the right areas within your instance. Setting your communication limits. So setting, obviously, when your emails are going out, how many times a week people can be emailed and a day is really important, because you don't want things going, you haven't had a chance to really look at everything that's happening yet in your instance and what's already firing, what things might be automatically happening. Automation is great. That's what we want to be happening in there. But if you've not had a chance to really dive in and map that out, then you want to make sure those limits are in place to make sure that you are not over communicating with people, and therefore potentially increasing your unsubscribes and everything that we know. So set those communication limits. And then also start setting your smart campaign settings. So that's going to be in your admin panel as well. And that's going to be how a threshold of when a smart campaign can trigger. If too many people are potentially going to be affected by that smart campaign, then it'll stop that from triggering. And so you want to set that at about, I've heard from a really great Adobe consultant that they go with about 20% of their database. But obviously, some people are going to have millions and millions of people in your database. So what I would recommend is actually going with one of your segmentations, one of your larger segmentations, and going 20% of that. That just means that if enough people through the filters would potentially go through that smart campaign, and when it batch sends, it would send to all of them talking emails. It will stop that from happening. And then you would have to manually change it to allow that to happen. And then you could manually turn it off. So just setting these limits early on are going to make sure that you've got risk mitigation control set while you start to dive into the rest of it. The next thing, sorry, Kimberly. Can we go to the next slide? Sorry, Kimberly. Yep, thanks. Sorry, that was my fault because I switched up how I was talking.
Okay. You're good.
Anyways, moving on, guys. Welcome to our mug. Okay, yeah. So the next one this is one of my personal favorites. I just earlier when I said thinking about what we've got in stock for you in documentation, Rico came. This is actually his image. This is real documentation he did of his stack. So he'll speak to it in a little bit about the methodology behind it. But map your stack, fully understand your whole tech stack and how it integrates and how it flows. And that's not just necessarily everything that only touches Marketo. It could be everything that's feeding into something that touches Marketo, right? So you want to understand how data is flowing in, how it's also flowing out, how it's being used, what the expectations of it are. And you especially want to evaluate your Marketo and CRM sync. What fields are writing to your CRM? What fields are writing back from your CRM into Marketo? What programs are firing those and what triggers are allowing that to happen? Make sure that data isn't overwriting itself that needs to be stored. Make sure that you've got a full view of everything, and who owns that stack, who owns your CRM. Do you own it as the admin? Is there somebody else? Who would you escalate things to if there's an issue within that? And then also all of your other integrations, like we mentioned, everything that's coming through, you're going to find that in your admin panel and launch point, but also your webhooks, because those can sometimes be forgotten about when you're thinking about integrations and data and how things are triggering to come into your or out of your Marketo instance. I'm a sucker for documentation.
I am too. I get it. So Rico, because this is your amazing screenshot, would love to hear your thoughts here.
Yeah, so one of the most difficult parts of inheriting that instance is understanding all of the different platforms and integrations within a company. So the objective for me was to concisely diagram these platforms, functions, owners, departments, stages even. So luckily this was built in Lucidchart, but there's a tool stack implement adopted from Winning by Design. And it's a great starting point for people just trying to build this type of diagram out. As with any other template, you'll quickly want to adapt it to your needs. So one of the features I added was color coding that gives a quick description of the integration type. So it could be CRM only, marketing automation platform, CRM and marketing automation platform. Maybe it's a multi-integration. Maybe it's unknown, or maybe it's not integrated at all. Maybe it's, completely within your own ecosystem. I also added internal owners and department heads so that this can be used as a quick reference guide for your team, the marketing team, and even beyond, so that people, when they have questions, they know who to turn to.
Yeah, I love that. Cool.
Perfect. Okay, carrying on, moving on in the admin section. This one is going to be a little a curveball. Not everybody will say this is one of the most important things to look at. But again, like Rico said, we can't be exhaustive on everything about how to inherit an instance. So we really wanted to touch on some of the things that you may not think about as the dead obvious ones to immediately touch. And one of those things is your channels and tags and how your programs are built. So I would disagree. I would say this is very important because this is going to touch everything from your reporting to your campaign ops team and how they're building things. Some questions to ask here. How many and what channels are being used? Are they clear? Do they align with what your strategy is? Do you know that they're supporting your marketing initiatives? When I say, are they clear? I mean, is it obvious what they are? A lot of times you might find synonyms in there and things that mean something, or things that internally mean something, but they're not obvious to the teams that might be using it, or obvious when it comes to reporting and you wouldn't be able to cut data the way that you needed to. Are there any there that aren't being used that you can archive? And this is one of the best things I think you can do, because if you have a lot of channels and tags and therefore program success statuses that are sitting in there unused, when you then go to build your programs, you easily could potentially choose the wrong statuses, and all of a sudden you have data pulling in from 3 or 4 different things because there might be statuses attached to channels that are no longer being used, right? Do they make sense for the programs you're running and the objectives, like I mentioned earlier? And then with the program statuses specifically, do they show progression? Are they showing people moving through the program, through your funnel? And then are tags needed? Do they make sense for you? Is it something that you need to use, or should they be added if they're not being used to help with your reporting? So if you find yourself answering no to a lot of those, or any of those, I would say your next step beyond just the immediate cleanup that you could do of archiving some would be to look at doing like a program and channel overhaul. So we just did this at Zora as a separate project, not as part of an instance inheritance, but just as a refresh of our instance to bring it to a healthier state. And it has been one of the most impactful projects that we've done long-term. A lot of it was behind the scenes and people didn't see it. And it took actually months to go through and meet with stakeholders and really make sure that we were nailing down what we needed to. And it had a few more elements of things that we're going to talk about later, but it was a really great project to be part of, and it had significant positive impacts. So definitely think about your planning, your channels, your tags, your program successes. And then finally, in the admin section, 2 hidden treasures to talk about that you may know about, which is great, but if you don't, then these are great ones to jump on. The first one is the treasure chest. So this is going to be in your admin section. It's going to be at the very bottom of the left-hand tree. And it's basically an area that Marketo can add some experimental features to let the GA trial, give feedback on. It's not usually given its spotlight, and very often it's not going to be the way that main features are rolled out, but it does house one very great feature that we want you to turn on if you've not been using it yet today, first step, and that's Campaign Inspector. So Campaign Inspector actually doesn't sit in the admin section. You turn it on here in your treasure chest, you enable it, and then it's actually in marketing activities, but obviously to bring it all together, let's chat about it now. Campaign Inspector is going to show you what it says, all of your campaigns, and give you a way to filter and inspect them, inspect what's happening within your instance, and immediately bring out some of those red flags for you. So you're going to be able to look at your active and inactive trigger campaigns. You're going to be able to see campaigns that are using campaign as requested as a trigger, which is a really important one to have an idea of how many of those are happening. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. You can also filter by your batch campaigns, those that are scheduled, those that are consistently run, those that are going to run the first time, those that have never run and could potentially be archived, especially if they're quite old. And then also your inactive campaigns. So it's going to give a really great overview of functionality and data flow and health and what's actually happening in your instance. So in the admin section, turn that on if you haven't done.
Yeah, it's also really good when you get in trouble, like something's wrong. You can go quickly figure out what you need to shut down. Not speaking from experience. Nope, not at all. Mm-mm.
Oh, never.
All right.
So now we're going to give a few tips around the Pandora's box that's known as the database section. As we're getting into this, I wanted to just spotlight a quick note about these smart lists, especially system smart lists. Take cursory stock of the quantity of records for each of those lists. Review the criteria for each list. If you feel that the number is like too large or too small, it's not quite what you would expect. For instance, regarding the health of your overall database, less than 7% possible duplicates is the industry standard in a healthy database. But just something to keep in mind. Also, when you're looking at something like unsubscribes, an average B2B unsubscribe rate is hard to nail down, as you can Google that, and different publications will quote a range from 19% to 48%. So just know and understand the average unsubscribe rate for your industry and compare it to the percentage of your database currently unsubscribed. Acquisition program, or in this case, no acquisition program captured. This gives insight into the changes you may need to make to your campaign or program creation process, so that you're capturing those acquisition program details. This could sit within your program templates or in a central operations program, and we'll talk about that more a little bit later. Finally, the block list can provide extremely valuable insight. Does it block the intended audience, or are there people in there that shouldn't be in there? Is this inclusive of any competitors or bad actors? One thing about this, I know we're talking about this as an inheriting an instance. I feel, especially this one, it's a list that should be reviewed periodically. With this baseline information, establish your data policies for what I stupidly call this BRAD, and it stands for backup, retention policy, archiving, and deleting. We maybe have different definitions of what cool is, obviously, but what the cool kids are talking about with this risk reduction and compliance, it shouldn't be a surprise that compliance is high on the list of action items when you're inheriting the instance. So locating and understanding the current compliance policy is paramount to the protection and success of your company and, frankly, your job. So take the time to review and document the policy if it hasn't been already. During this time, you'll want to address any gaps or unclear areas in the process. I'd also take this time to re-engage with your legal team or any other pertinent departments and make sure it has been reviewed and approved by them. If there isn't one already, establish a cadence of review sessions to revisit and update the policies with your team. Sometimes it could be quarterly, sometimes it could be annually. Just set something up, take that initiative. Also, while you're working on the documentation itself, remember to mark a version number and a revision date on that documentation as you incorporate those changes to your Marketo instance. Also test as you're incorporating those changes. Some additional notes that I have about the compliance section is think about your landing pages. We'll talk about this a little bit more in the design studio. Do all those landing pages have the privacy and compliance appropriate footers? If not, now's your chance to really check those snippets and use those snippets if that's the strategy you want to adopt. Also, check to make sure that all your forms are GDPR compliant, the whole thing with making sure that those boxes aren't checked by default. And lastly, remember to check for the stamping of those dates on the records themselves. So as they're syncing to your database or CRM, make sure that you're flagging it for things such as compliance, opt-in, double opt-in, opt-outs, and dating that. If anything, especially at the start of inheriting that instance, it's better to be a little bit too stringent than not being stringent enough.
Definitely. All right. Moving into the design studio, which is often overlooked, but it's still vital, right? We want to go through all these different areas of our instance. We're not going to talk about the individual different elements that sit within the design studio. Instead, we want to take a strategic overlook and change our perspective of it. So what I want you all to think about when you come into this new instance is, does the organization currently have a global outlook or a local outlook? Now, saying this, I'm a fan of a global outlook, but I've always worked for global organizations that made sense for what we needed. So I'm going to talk to that if you find yourself in that same situation. But it could also be that local is what's needed, and there are reasons that that's needed. So again, this is going to come down to the strategies that you've discussed with all your stakeholders and coming into it, and also understanding why things might be built. So you might walk into your instance and realize that it's all local, but understanding the context of why it was built that way. Rolling that out, taking a wider view of, which I've more frequently seen, where things are built very local, but they could have really benefited from a global outlook. That's what I want to talk about today, changing that perspective within the instance in your design studio from local to global. So thinking about that, it is thinking about your emails, your forms, your landing pages, and how they're used. So if I inherited an instance and it all had local assets, I would start with the forms first, then I would move to landing pages and then emails. And I'll kind of discuss why I would go down that route. With forms, I would create a global set of forms that meets the needs of the business. This is going to be the easiest one to change out. Saying that, obviously, I recognize that you could have hundreds and hundreds of programs potentially using local forms. And so when I say easy, take that with a grain of salt. Every instance is very different. And I have seen instances that use a lot of local forms. So I'm not saying that it would be like a day job for you, but it has some of the lowest risk, because you'll be working on it within that instance and be able to change things out as you go and document as you make those changes. And there's not necessarily like an outside facing element to it other than the forms that are sitting on pages and whatnot. So I would start with forms. And I would always include the form number in the name, so that as you capture that data and the form is filled in, you'll be able to, if something goes wrong, you'll be able to identify what form it is and go make a quick change in that area. Then with landing pages, I would start with creating a library of global pages first and use those to start rolling out any net new campaigns that come up that need landing pages. Start fresh there before worrying about necessarily going back and rebuilding everything that's already been built. And part of that is because you want to work with your web team to make sure that as you do start to switch landing pages out from maybe local ones, again, if they need to be local, there's a reason for that. But if you're changing them to that global view, then you want to make sure you're not losing any SEO along the way. You want to make sure you're not hurting any of the campaigns that might be high performers or even low performers. You don't want to cause any damage while you're doing these changes. So this is obviously more of a project. You'll view it within the instance, you'll know what you need to do, and it could take a longer time to change that out. Then with emails, that's kind of the last one I would touch. And that's because that's going to be the area where I've seen the most need and the most need an explanation for having local, because it could be that email was just needed to be used for whatever campaign that is. Or you could have like a no-code email designer tool. Several of them sit out there, and it makes it really easy for people to create those local emails that just need to be attached to one campaign and go out. And so there may not be a need to change that. You might have a global perspective for your landing pages, for your forms. You might be able to tokenize your landing pages, make everything nice and neat. But for emails, it just makes it more efficient for campaign ops and getting things out the door and standing up those campaigns really quickly to have local. So they would be the last one I would touch, especially because in the past, I have had those tools that make it really easy for field marketers or campaign ops to create their own emails. So we don't need that full set of templates. But if you did, then I would say when you start to do that, look at where you can tokenize and where you can add snippets in. So snippets are going to be great because they can just be added, like Rico was saying, you can just add and drop them in when he was talking about snippets earlier. So do they use them already and how are they being used? And that's going to add a lot of value from that email perspective. With the design studio, again, it isn't necessarily where the meat and potatoes lie. We're coming on to that area next, which I know a lot of you guys have been waiting for, but it's not one that you want to forget.
Yeah, so meat and potatoes, or potatoes and potatoes if you are vegetarian, which is cool also. So organization, and I hate that that's a synonym because it could mean company, but in this case, we're talking about like how organized is it? So by jumping into these marketing activities, you're going to get an instant barometer of the organization of the instance just by looking at the folder structure. So does that folder structure reflect what you would expect based on the channel tags you reviewed in the admin section? Factor in the number of users or roles in the instance. Does the organization of your marketing activities allow for efficiency? Is there a clear and concise naming convention for your programs? And I think that rolls up to that folder structure. If not, create one and don't forget to document it. I wanted to highlight, I guess, or point out these screenshots. These are examples of how to obtain that program ID and form ID for your naming convention. So open up, click on a program, an asset, even a folder, and you will actually see in the address bar of the browser this code. Normally it'll start with something like PG or ME. We utilize that program ID in the naming convention because if you think about your end users doing the day-to-day work, rather than having to look at something sort of like email one, they could just start typing in that program ID number and it should bring up all of the assets for that particular program. So same thing with form ID. And I think it's awesome because if you have to just troubleshoot on maybe a form that lives outside of Marketo, looking at the source and just searching for that form ID number is a real quick and easy way to find it. Some additional, I guess, quick improvements. We talked about it, or we talked about all these different like acronyms and like maybe defining terms for reporting. So one of the things I incorporated at a few of my companies is a cheat sheet explaining that naming convention and definitions for terms used at your company, especially when you're having those meetings and having discussions about reporting. Let's make sure we're talking about the same thing. So one thing that I would probably put on the definition list is leads, because talk to sales or talk to marketing, they have different definitions of that. If you don't have one, I would consider a program name generator or a UTM builder. And you could usually find some great starting points online, but even a shared worksheet is a helpful way to sort of get everyone aligned. And it also serves as like an additional historical log of various acronyms and various approaches that you've used. Alongside that, standardizing UTMs. We didn't really touch on UTMs, but some sort of UTM strategy, especially around UTM medium and UTM source, to minimize the complication of your operational programs. As you want to make sure that you're maybe using something like paid search instead of PPC, CPC, or any other iteration, or at least getting aligned with your stakeholders and other team members so that we're utilizing the right UTMs and we know what to look for. The other thing that I wanted to talk about was this description section. It's sort of opened on this example here, but normally it's just a grayed out area that has maybe text or maybe it's empty, and it shows directly below the program or asset name. I've incorporated using that as like a change log. And so we date it, we even put our initials so that we know what iteration it's going through or what custom edits or solutions are added to that specific asset. So that's a great place because sometimes, especially when you're inheriting an instance, it may have, last modified by, and then it's blank. So that doesn't really help. Lastly, I wanted to say that we talk about naming conventions. I'm gonna annoy you with that and the word documentation, but apply that same naming conventions to everything, including the design studio. I think it's just makes everything easier to communicate over.
That's definitely great. I just thought of something as you were saying that, Rico, that not only is this great to do it when you're inheriting an instance, it's great if you've walked in and somebody's done that for you. But if you know that you might be leaving an instance, it's really kind to go and do some of this kind of stuff for the person that might be coming in and inheriting your instance. So while this is great to set up, I would keep it going so that when it's time for you to leave, you're setting up the next person for success. And we're all one big community and family here working in Marketo and in MOPS. So as I was thinking that, I was like, oh, it'd be so good when people do that for the next person coming in too, especially for high value campaigns. I'm not saying go through all your archived campaigns and add that in, but so moving on. Centralized intelligence, or really like a centralized operations program. Do you like our intelligence gift there? We love it. So with this, obviously, these are going to be ideas of programs and projects you can take on. But when you first enter into the instance, when you first are starting to work in it, look for where some of these things are built, if they are even built, and where they're housed and how you can start to pull them together. Because by pulling them together, you're going to create efficiencies. You're going to create one centralized program of truth, or group of programs of truth, folder of truth, if you will, where some really powerful things are housed. You can then tokenize it in ways where things are bouncing off each other in a great, efficient way, and it's going to make it really scalable. So I would start to look for, where does your lead scoring live and your demand signals? Are they in one place? Can you bring them all together rather than have them in individual programs based on that activity? Bring it together into one program that's firing and triggering when those separate activities are happening. Same with your routing. If that's not built outside of it in a different tool, if you have all your routing there, definitely bring it into one place. And if possible to tokenize it, then I would do that, because then you can go in, you can change it from a top-down perspective and change it in one place, and it'll filter all the way through. Your data standardization, hygiene, enrichment, all of those programs, they're going to be working cohesively together, hopefully. That's what we want to get them to that point, and working in parallel with each other. So bring them together where you can. So you understand and you have a holistic view of what's happening when something comes into your instance, what's firing, what's being enriched by which programs. And if you need to make changes, you're not looking all over the instances in the instance to bring that in. Same with notifications. So if you have the ability to send alerts, if you have the ability, you do have the ability, you work in Marketo, if you want to send alerts to people based off certain things, rather than have those alerts built into the program that should be firing it, they fill in a form, somebody gets a notification. Consider bringing that in using the naming convention to identify when it should fire and when those alerts should go out, because then if you need to make changes to the alerts or who they go to, you're just making them in one centralized place versus trying to find all the programs that sit anywhere else in your marketing activities to make those changes. Same with your interesting moments. I've seen it where the interesting moment program name or description is going to be stamped in the individual program, but the actual capture of the interesting moment and all the data that might go around it, the timing and all that, is in a centralized location. So when your team or when you're building out your programs, then all you have to do is drop in what that program name is, or you can use a token even to capture that. But the actual interesting moment is happening one place. So when you want to add interesting moments, when you want to turn things off, again, you're not going to all your different programs that might be impacting it. You're doing in that one centralized area. And then the last one, is there a bounce management program? And this is one that I shout from the rooftops about, because you don't know you need it until it's too late and you need it and you wish you had that information. And there's a lot of good documentation, so we won't go into how to build one. That could be a whole nother webinar we could do on how to build one, but definitely look if there's anything that's capturing how many times emails are bouncing, what the bounce codes are, if there's any delivered emails after bounce. If that stuff is being captured elsewhere, bring it into one program, into your centralized intelligence. If it's not happening at all, then that's a great place to add some immediate value and impact into your instance.
So to me, system performance is a little bit of a funny thing because it's one of those things that you'll notice more, especially if you have a larger instance. But it's always good to maintain your instance with system performance in mind. For instance, how many triggers and batch campaigns are you using? Both can add complete strain on your instance if you're not using them optimally. One note to remember with your trigger campaigns is that they fire for every activity, despite whether the parameters are met or not. They're always going to have to run to determine if the conditions are met to run records through that flow. So they are constantly checking for that activity. So think about that as a large drain. How many request campaign steps are built into your program architecture? Frequently, these will be built in like piggyback type of chains. So further taxing the system. So consider those executable campaigns as an alternative. And we make mention of a reference to that in our resources section.
Yeah, that's really good. Same with batch campaigns. While in many ways they can decrease strain on your system, because like Rico mentioned, the trigger campaigns are consistently looking for if the parameters met, if the conditions are met. So batch campaigns and running things through in groups is a really great alternative. But if you're running large numbers through those batch campaigns all at the same time, or really consistently, or doing at a certain time of the day, you're going to add strain during that time on your API calls, on your CRM sync. So remember, again, throw back to that campaign inspector. It's a really great place to look where all this is happening. This is an image here of exactly that. This is where you can go in and see all your triggered campaigns, campaign is requested, all your batch campaigns, so on and so forth. But then that kind of leans onto as well, what is your API usage like? You can see this in the admin web services API section. And in the January release, I think it was, Adobe has included the ability to now check your bulk API export. And it'll let you look at the amount of daily allocation that's being used over the course of the last 7 days. So that's a really good thing to keep an eye on as well. And then kind of flowing with that, it's looking at streamlining that performance and scalability is there a great token strategy? Here's a really good example of using tokens. You can use them for your scoring, to drop information into programs, to capture and stamp information. So is there a strategy in place when you're building your templates and your folders and whatnot? And always use the naming convention for your tokens as well. So it makes sense to you. It makes sense to whoever might be inheriting the instance after you as well.
Well, before we dive into our last section and then leave a little bit of time for Q&A, I just wanted, this is all really good stuff. So I really wanted to know from both of you, what is the one thing that you learned from inheriting an instance that you absolutely love and still do in your new instances today?
Do you want to go first, Rico, or do you want me to?
Go for it.
Oh, mine's going to be so lame because we've talked about it so much, but that's why we've talked about it so much. And it's the most beautiful instance I've ever seen walking into had great documentation. It had all the areas that we've touched on today, really clear, and it made it really easy to enter in and start creating efficiencies and adding value because I knew exactly what was happening. And that included it like a really great token strategy. It was tokenized from top to bottom. And I mean that like from great marketing activities level tokens for things like addresses, year changes, things like that, all the way down to program level tokens so that the Center of Excellence program templates could be easily cloned and immediately utilized. So that would be mine.
For me, it's a toss-up between just really obsessive compulsive folder structure, especially when you're jumping into a fresh instance to you, but also it would be that call log section or change log section. It often works for me. It was working like a little bit of an Easter egg, like you'd be working through some stuff and then you'd get this note from your predecessor saying, hey, just FYI, this is something. And it's like, I love you. I don't even know who you are, but I love you. So those are my two favorites.
Oh, those are both really good. All right, let's finish up with the game plan.
Perfect. So we don't want to leave you guys just with a bunch of tips and tricks and all this. Like we said earlier, in the marketing community, in Marketing Nation, there's some really great resources. So we started to compile those together, and we'll flesh out that list before we send this out. But in there's actually like a really good itemized like inheritance checklist. And so that's a great place to get started. But if you want to get started today, or you're coming into a new instance, or you're thinking about it, then what are your tenets, because there's 10 of them, to get started with? So meet with your stakeholders, evaluate your documentation that's already there, set some practical governance so nothing is going just crazy and skew-iffy while you're trying to start to build things. Map out your stack and really understand how your data is flowing, because that's really important. Understand your channels and your tags, and understand your wider database. Review your compliance, make sure you're compliant, make sure legal's on board. It's really important, guys. Assess your approach, organize and centralize where you can, and then optimize your system performance. And we actually had another one that was just take a breath and take your time. Hopefully you're in a situation where you have an onboarding ramping up period to really understand this before you're like under fire to start delivering. So really try to take your time to make sure that you have done all this and more, so you set yourself up for success. Here's some of the resources we've started to pull together for you, but I think after talking and then after questions, coming off the questions, we'll throw some more in off of the questions that are asked.
All right. With that being said, I'll ask some of the Q&A that's been coming in, and then I will also stop screen sharing and pull some of these clickable links for you all so that you can gather those, and then I'll be sure to include them in the follow-up email. So first question, and Courtney, I think I'll go to you first because I think you had an idea of this, but Rico, feel free to chime in too. What is a good rule for emails per week for those comm limits?
Yes, so I would say 2 per day. This is talking about your marketing emails, not your operational emails. So 2 marketing emails a day. And then, so personally, me, no more than 3 a week. I've heard industry standards are 4 a week. But for me, if I was receiving more than 3 a week from an organization, I would start to kind of feel a bit fatigued. So 2 a day and 3 a week, 3 to 4 a week.
Agreed, but also have that discussion with your stakeholders and
No, that's very good.
All goes back to the tenants.
Don't just go arbitrarily because you heard it on this webinar.
Right. Another question was around, Rico, was around your documentation template. I think you mentioned where you pulled it from. Can you mention again what that was, where that was from?
Sorry, the tech stack one?
Yeah, the pretty colorful one.
So it was an out of the box template from Lucid Charts. So if you have a subscription to that, you can pull it. I think it was called SaaS Tool Stack, but the name of the company that developed it is Winning by Design. And if you actually Google that, it'll send you to like their whole thought process. And I think there's a link there to that starter.
Cool. Thank you. Yeah, I do love documentation, so that's a good question. Okay, next question. If you delete leads from the database that are invalid or bounced emails, and they come in from another lead source at a later date, is there a way to automatically flag them?
That's a pickle that I don't know right off the top of my head. And if you guys have a solution for that, please let me know, because that's something we look at too.
I know that's a really good one. I definitely, obviously with durable unsubscribe, if they've unsubscribed, it's going to flag them into the unsubscribes again. It's going to, but just invalid or bounced, I don't know if it would immediately, okay. When I put this out there, please do not hold me to this, because that's not something I've looked at specifically, but I don't know if it would necessarily automatically flag it again until it bounced again. And then it would go into your system smart list is what I believe, but I don't want to be quoted on that.
Yeah, I think the only way I know to do it outside of durable unsubscribe, which is the only metric you can keep track of, is to have like a data lake where you would like rejoin that information by an anonymous, like unidentifiable union ID, which is like well above what I understand in data lake land. So I think you'd have to have like a data person that could help you join that information later and do a check. But yeah, that's a really tough one. It's a really good question though. Okay, next question. We do have like a shout out for UTMs and like Google Sheets. Using a shared sheet is really helpful. So it's good to hear that other people are doing that for UTMs and campaign names. The question is around the central intelligence. So how do you organize central intelligence, or where is it located in Marketo?
That's a great question. So it's actually not its own area of Marketo. It's an operations folder that you can create. So I'd recommend in your marketing activities, having your programs that are running, having any kind of data hygiene, all that kind of stuff in a separate folder that's for operations. So it's like if you had which also maybe is a great idea to talk about. There's a whole, a really great webinar demand coming out of the summit that happened in March around the Center of Excellence. But like you have a Center of Excellence and you would build it out, this would be a folder that you would build out. So it doesn't already exist. It'd be one that you'd want to go build. You could call it whatever you wanted to, operations, centralized intelligence, whatever it might be, and then start to build the programs in there. So you have like an operational folder.
Just to tag on to that, I think one of the ways that I like doing it is building that center of excellence at the bottom. So using a wild card like an asterisk to, sort of force that to the very bottom of your marketing activity structure. And then just as a side note, putting your templates at the top so that you can test and inherit those tokens to your active programs.
That's a really good point. I learned that like way too late in my Marketo life. Way too late. No, that's really good. Okay, another question is, does anybody have any best practice documentation examples? Aside from that Lucidchart one, I don't. Well, that's not true. I did a webinar on it once, but I'll find it and put it in the follow-up. I just don't remember what the link is. We'll try and gather some links for sure in the follow-up, but do you guys have any places you go to, like Google off the top of your head?
For me, it depends on the company that you're at. Your company might have an established way of how like those SOPs and any documentation needs to look. So use that as a starting point. If not, you sort of have free reign. So I like to try to be as consistent as possible. So start off your documentation with a template. So maybe, the name, the objective, what, the summary of what this is for, and then write out your stuff underneath that, and then use that formatting for every documentation piece you go through after the fact.
Yeah, that's a good point. The consistency totally helps once you have like a consistent theme going on, then people kind of know what to look for. So, and then there is a question. I don't know the answer to this. I thought they did. Invalids, it's saying invalids don't count against your database total size, right? I thought they did.
Me too.
Okay. I think they do. And again, the comment was that as much as I'd like to keep the database free of invalid, unqualified leads, it might make sense to quarantine them if you're concerned about them coming back, which I agree with that. Although once we have invalids and a bunch of other criteria that they've met, then we delete them, because I don't like paying for leads that are just not ever going to be talked to. If they come back in, then that's their fault. I blame them. But yeah, no, it's a really tough situation, because you don't want to pay to store them, but then you also worry about them coming back in and being invalid and causing issues. So it really probably depends on your organization and how strict they are too. So my last check with Marketo, they do count. Okay, thank you. Yes, I agree. And yes, we went over our total at 1.2. So cool. Any other questions? I know we have like 1 minute left. So thank you everyone for joining. Oh, there's requests. Can they connect with you all on LinkedIn, Courtney and Rico?
Yes, I'm more than happy to.
Awesome.
Yes, absolutely.
Cool. And same here. But no, thank you so much everyone for joining. I hope this was helpful. Courtney and Rico, this was amazing. Thank you so much everyone for joining. And we hope to see you all in the future. So join that Bevy group.
Definitely. Oh, thanks everybody. This is great.
Thank you.
Have fun out there.